Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been released from her 6-year-long detention in Iran. This photo shows her on a flight out of the country. Zaghari-Ratcliffe had been held since 2016 when she was arrested on charges of plotting to overthrow Iran's government, an allegation which she denied. This was the emotional moment when a BBC newsreader announced the development.
Two detained British Iranians, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashuri, heading to... Sorry, this is a moving moment because these are people who have been detained for some time. So we're hearing that Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashuri are heading to the airport in Tehran to leave the country, their lawyer, Hojat Kamani, has said.
So why has Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe been released now? Well, her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, has long maintained she was being held as a bargaining chip from Iran to pressure Britain into paying a debt it owed to the country. In September 2020, he explained the situation to Kay Burley.
If I'm honest, I think Nazanin was picked up in the first place to get that money. There was a.
This is money that we owe because
this is money that the UK owes Iran, going back to an arms deal that was done in the 1970s that then fell apart after the revolution. Big long battle about how much compensation needed to be paid back and so on. In the end, it went to court and there was a court award which was then held up payment due to sanctions. Over time, that's become an increasingly bad-tempered relationship and ended to the point where, we were taken hostage and have been held ever since.
That debt to Iran, which Britain had refused to pay, amounted to £400 million. That's according to an international court. The British government have now belatedly confirmed that debt has been paid, hence Nazanin's release. But this leads to a second question. Why did this payment happen now? Why didn't Britain settle its debts 6 years ago? Well, there's speculation that the resolution of this particular dispute could be related to the renewed attempt by Joe Biden to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. The deal was signed by Barack Obama in 2015, but was killed by his successor, Donald Trump. Ever since then, Iran has been subject to crippling sanctions which have pushed millions of Iranians into poverty and provided a barrier to the UK repaying that £400 million that they owed to Iran. So potentially, the payment that enabled this release was made possible because of progress in ongoing negotiations to lift sanctions on Iran. But now we have a third question. Why are the Americans suddenly in such a rush to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal? Joe Biden has been president for over a year, yet progress with Iran had until recently been slow. And this is where it gets really interesting. Last week, CNN reported that in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration has been attempting to reopen relations with oil-producing nations like Venezuela and Iran, which have up to now been cut off from the US. With Russian oil subject to sanctions, Biden wants oil from Iran and Venezuela back on the market, and all of a sudden, Western sanctions which have long crippled entire economies can be lifted. Don't get me wrong, I'll be glad if sanctions on Venezuela and Iran are lifted. They have achieved nothing except pushing millions of people into extreme poverty. But is this the way policy should be made? We'll trash your economy until we need your oil. It's geopolitical games like these that meant Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe spent 6 years away from her young daughter. And she is far, far from the only victim.
I mean, it's absolutely wonderful to have Nazanin on her way home now. It's been a grueling 6 years for her and her family. Her daughter in particular has been robbed of precious formative years with her mother. Richard Ratcliffe is also a really wonderful person. I've had the pleasure of meeting him. And he has really set the bar for husbands, because I'm now looking at my man like, if I was in detention, how tirelessly would you campaign for my release? But I think that this, firstly, this story really sheds a light about how sanctions in particular are deployed politically, especially when we think about, rather than, humanitarianly, which is what we're often told, especially when we think about the story where sort of Saudi Arabia and why we don't see similar policies leveled against Saudi Arabia, which is an economic ally of the UK and of the US. And it's a problem. This story shows us why it's a problem that sanctions are framed as this kind of non-violent solution to conflicts. Now, obviously, it's not the same as dropping bombs on a city. The violence is much less immediate, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a real human cost, that this isn't some kind of act of war on the people, because it tends to hit everyday people the most, which includes those like Nazanin and also Anusha Ashuri, who has also been released today, but also affecting people in a more general sense, the populations of countries that sanctions hit. For example, people with disabilities are in particularly deeply affected because sanctions don't just hit food, they also hit materials and ingredients that are used in medication. This is a chronic issue, and for people who don't have relatives in unsanctioned countries who can send medication back, that tends to be the working class people who have disabilities or chronic and terminal illnesses. These are the people that are hardest hit by sanctions. So we can't speak of sanctions as a non-violent act, and that's why when sanctions are implemented, we as a public have to scrutinize those sanctions, who they're hitting, why they're being implemented, who will suffer. They need to be scrutinized with the same keen eye as we might scrutinize more obvious acts of war or more explicit acts of violence. And we've also, we've spoken a lot over the past few weeks about how seemingly neutral or like descriptive categories like refugee seem to take on very different meanings depending on who is occupying that category at any one time. We've talked about it in terms of the differential treatment by the media of Ukrainian refugees versus refugees from the Middle East and Africa. And I think that the same goes here, but when it comes to the category of citizen, we think of citizen as like a description, right? Like if you have certain papers, then you're a citizen. But what we're seeing here, I don't think that it's the fact that Anusha Ashuri and Nazanin Ratcliffe have been languishing in an Iranian jail for 6 years, when clearly there was a way out of that, there was a route out of that. That politicians like Boris Johnson were wantonly reckless about her case, but then still went on to become prime minister. I don't think there's a disconnection between that abandonment and the fact that these are two people who are dual Iranian British citizens, who are brown dual citizens. We already can see that there is a differential treatment between how Black and brown people, particularly those who have either dual citizenship, but also now, because of the Nationality and Borders Bill, people who are eligible to apply for a second citizenship, are at increased risk of having their human rights attacked, particularly by being made stateless. So that tells us that there's a differential responsibility here that the British state sees itself as having for protecting people who have any non-British heritage in their background, and particularly in their immediate background. And so I think that, this is a day for celebration, but it tells us a lot about both the political use of sanctions and the fact that there is a real human cost to sanctions, and it's often the most vulnerable who are impacted by it, but also that there is a crisis of citizenship happening right now, and that all citizens are not made equal when it comes to what the British state, the allowances and the resources that the British state is willing to put in order to back the human rights of certain people in this country.